Hi everybody, and welcome back to Geology 112, Bringing Dinosaurs to Life. We're just going to have a short lecture for this week as we get ready for our little brief Thanksgiving break. And so I thought it would be an appropriate time to actually cover the relationship of dinosaurs and birds and why the bird sitting at your Thanksgiving Day table is actually a dinosaur. Here we have the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx lithographica, possibly one of the most important, definitely one of the most famous fossils ever discovered. There's only a handful of Archaeopteryx specimens, and they all come from the Jurassic Age Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria. And this crow-sized animal is pretty important. As you can see, its head is bent back over its spine, doing this very dramatic death pose. There's taphonomic causes for that. But notice on the tips of its fingers, which it has fingers, there are claws. It has a mouthful of teeth, a long bony tail. It has hollow limb bones. Yet coming off the body, we have these feather-like impressions. So if we were to remove those feather impressions, we'd say, oh, it's a small theropod dinosaur, some kind of small little coelurosaur. And in fact, it is, but it's much more derived from that. This is one of the first evidence that we get that there's a strong relationship between dinosaurs and birds. And while I don't like to use the term missing link, if you were to look for a fossil that indicates that transition from non-avian dinosaurs to modern-day birds, look no further. This has characteristics of both. And in fact, really what this does is broaden our imagination a bit on what kind of soft tissue characteristics were present on non-avian dinosaurs, such as feathers. But this is really what gets the ball rolling into the discussion of birds and dinosaurs. And a couple of things I want to point out. This transition didn't happen overnight. We're looking at 150 million years of transitioning for something such as Archaeopteryx to something like a chicken. And at first glance, they may not seem that similar. We have to remember that when we visualize modern day birds, we visualize them as living things, such as a chicken. Or since it's Thanksgiving season, if you were to ask a little kid to draw a turkey, they're probably going to do that classic trace their hand and then, draw on a beak. They're not going to draw a skeletal outline. When you look at something like a dinosaur skeleton or Archaeopteryx, for that matter, we see the skeletal features, and then we have to imagine what the soft tissue was like. When we look at a modern day bird, we usually, with those kind of reconstructions, we're usually thinking of how it looks fleshed out, and we don't think about what that skeleton looks like. So here you have a skeleton of Archaeopteryx and a skeleton of a chicken. And it's if we line them up this way, we can see the similarities much more strikingly, and also look at how the differences came to be over that 150 million years of evolution. So what are some of these characteristics that have changed over that 150 million years? Well, we've gone from a snout with teeth in it, such as like this kind of reptilian style mouth, to a beak with no teeth. Now, as we look, we're looking at end members here, like the head of Archaeopteryx and the head of a crow, for example. But if you actually look at the fossil record in between these two animals, you can see that transition happen. We go from having wings that have clawed fingers at the end to all of those fingers morphing together essentially into one digit with these feathers coming off of it. Again, we're looking at end members of the evolutionary scale here, and we can observe the fossils in between to see how that transition took place. The same thing happens when we go from a long bony tail to the short stubby tail birds have, which we call a pygostyle. Also the way that the feathers are arranged around it, which we can look at fossils and we can look at modern day birds and see how those feathers attached onto that tail or onto that pygostyle and how it's changed over time. So the transition, for example, to short tails start with our what we call non-avian dinosaurs, things like Microraptor, Caudipteryx, Citipati, which is an oviraptorosaur. All of these still have relatively long tails, but we have feather impressions of them that show these branching feathers coming off of the ends of the tails. And then we look at our avian dinosaurs from the Cretaceous. Sapiornis, Jeholornis, and Confuciusornis all show a reduction in bony tails, but long feathery tails. So it's almost like the tail overall isn't really changing much as far as size relative to the body, But what's making up the tail is a slow transition from 130 to 120 million years in the Cretaceous, going from these longer bony tails with feathers on them to the feathers getting longer and the bony tail itself reducing. So for example, when you look at Confuciusornis, there on the far right, it looks like it has two long tails coming off. Those are actually just feathers. While if you look at something like Microraptor, that actually does have a long, bony Saurolosaurus-style tail with feathers coming off of the end. And so we see that transition happening throughout the Cretaceous period. Now, what about the evolution of a hand versus a wing? Well, we can look in the fossil record and see the transitions of this, but we can also look at modern day birds, or at least some of them, and see this happening as well. On your left, you'll see the Hoatzin. The Hoatzin is a South American bird where as a chick, when it's young, and it doesn't have well-developed wings yet, it has different digits, individual digits on a hand. It has a true hand with fingers and claws and small wings. And so what it does is it climbs up trees and grips to them with these claws. As the forelimb continues to develop, as this chick grows into an adult and the feathers and the wings become more developed, eventually those little fingers just shrivel and fall off. Essentially, when the body gets to a certain point, the physiology switches over and it no longer feeds blood to the fingers and they just kind of fall off. So by the time you have an adult Hoatzin, there's no evidence, really, of just looking at it that it ever had fingers. But this change that happens during the Hoatzin's ontogeny is a reflection of the phylogeny, the evolution of birds from a non-avian theropod origin. So when we look at Archaeopteryx and it still has those clawed fingers on its wings, it probably functioned in some ways very similar to the modern day Hoatzin chick. However, the Hoatzin then goes through that extra ontogenetic step where then it becomes regular bird, I guess, if we want to use for lack of a better phrase, becomes a regular bird and flies around and doesn't need those claws anymore. But we know that Archaeopteryx and a lot of our other Cretaceous birds still have those fingers with claws, and we can look at the Hoatzin chick today to see how that evolutionary transition likely took place. Perhaps in a situation of some convergent evolution, though, we can look at some of our other non-avian theropods, such as the ornithomimids, like Ornithomimus or Gallimimus, and compare them to some of our large ratites or ground birds today, such as the ostrich or the emu. And we see very similar characteristics. We see their locomotion on the toes, the way their feet have developed is very, very similar. The large S-shaped neck, that's very flexible, same general body plan, a reduction in the arms, though ornithomimids still have pretty functional arms, and obviously a reduction in the tail. But if you really want to understand how an ornithomimid moved, you don't have to look any further than looking at an ostrich. In fact, even looking at the foot morphology itself, if we look at the arrangement of digits on the foot of a vulture and compare it to the foot of a dromaeosaurid such as Deinonychus, we can see very, very similar characteristics once again. That the big so-called killing claw on the dromaeosaurids like Deinonychus, which you see in the Jurassic Park movies, is their switchblade claw. A lot of modern day predatory birds, like our modern day raptors, the owls, hawks, and eagles, have very similar characteristics on their feet. These aren't for taking down giant prey, as we know. You rarely see a hawk try to take something like a deer down or up. Instead, they're used more for standing on prey that's smaller, their own size or a little bit smaller, to give them some balance and immobilize the prey as they're eating it. Vultures do the same thing. Owls, hawks, eagles do the same thing. They have modified claws for manipulating prey on their feet, since they're not using their arms for this kind of thing. Now, dromaeosaurids may or may not have used their arms and hands much at this stage, maybe just for keeping balance or for grabbing. But we know that modern day carnivorous birds use their wings to help stabilize themselves and their claws to stabilize themselves as they're feeding on smaller prey. And we have reason to believe, because the morphology is similar, that dromaeosaurids did something similar as well. In fact, the evolution of the hand morphology from a non-avian theropod in the earlier portions of the Mesozoic to our modern day birds, when you line these up, you can see that transition very, very clearly. If we look at Ornitholestes or Archaeopteryx, some of our Jurassic non-avian theropods, though Archaeopteryx is right there on the fence, we see the same type of hand morphology, obviously different scales and different sizes among Ornitholestes and Archaeopteryx. When we look at Cynornis, a Cretaceous bird, we see that that first digit is still independent, but notice digits 2 and 3 have started to fuse together. And but they're still rather small. So there were probably some limited but functional finger movements still on Cynornis. And then we look at our modern day chicken, and we have a fully fused chicken wing, just like you would eat while watching the game, right? You can actually see that transition though when you line these up. So next time you're eating chicken wings, pay close attention. If you're eating the whole wing, pay close attention to the bones that you're picking the meat off of, because that's where we see that transition happening from a non-avian theropod like Ornitholestes to our modern day chickens. Well, one of the things that, of course, kids like to do, and maybe some adults as well, around the Thanksgiving table is to, fight over the wishbone. The wishbone is actually a bone called the furcula that's present in all birds and theropod dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx had a wishbone. Bambiraptor, a very small dromaeosaurid, had a wishbone. T-Rex has a wishbone. So these are present on all birds, and it's essentially a bone that sits in between the breastbones, essentially, or the clavicles. So the presence of this today, we think of a wishbone as helpful in achieving flight. Really, the wishbone is helpful for how you move your arms. So when you watch the Jurassic Park films, pay attention in the Jurassic World films, pay attention to how the raptors are holding their hands. They're usually holding their hands where their wrists are bent kind of straight in front. In reality, though, dromaeosaurs, like modern birds, would have had their palms facing each other. So they could, think about like how you would clap your hands. That's how they actually held their hands. They weren't able to kind of rotate them downward or pronate them downward. So they were what we like to say is clappers, not slappers. And the furcula helps with this wing motion. So if you look at how a bird flaps its wings, they flap from like back to front. If you were to move your arms from back to front rather than from up to down, that's actually how flight motion and that arm movement is happening, and the furcula assists in this. So the furcula didn't evolve for flight. The furcula evolved to help with a grabbing motion. That grabbing motion later assisted in the evolution of flight, and the furcula has that function as well. As you continue to dissect your Thanksgiving turkey, when you get towards the end where you put the stuffing in, you'll notice that this turkey doesn't have a proper tail. It has a little nub that's sometimes nicknamed the parson's nose, but it's pygostyle. This is its little tail feature that you'll find just down towards the butt. When we look at some of our more derived non-avian theropods, such as some of our oviraptorosaurs like Nomangia, we can see a reduction in that bony tail approaching more of a pygostyle. When you don't need the tail to be long and bony, when you can replace that structure with feathers, which is a much more cheap supply than building bone in the body, we're going to see a reduction in that tail. And so when you're looking at the pygostyle on your Thanksgiving turkey or whatever bird you're ingesting, look for this feature as well as evidence of its non-avian theropod history. If you happen to look inside of a bone that gets broken on the Thanksgiving turkey or bird, you'll notice that it's hollow on the inside of those limbs, but there's lots of oblique struts going through. Modern day birds have this feature, and our theropod dinosaurs did as well. These are incredibly lightweight bones. Birds use that today to help with flight, to lighten the skeleton. Our non-avian theropods, though, had these lighter weight skeletons because part of the bird and non-avian theropod respiratory system goes through bones. So those air sacs and hollows are very important for that. They do allow a lighter skeleton, especially for some of our larger theropods, like even T-Rex had hollow bones. But those interior struts give it an incredible amount of strength. So even though these bones were lightweight, they weren't exactly delicate. They were very, very strong, similar to high-rise building grid works that they install. So T-Rex had hollow bones, but they were very strong. Dromaeosaurs had hollow bones, but they're very strong. Modern-day birds hollow bones that are proportionally very, very strong for their bodies. Because they're using it for all of these multiple functions. The hollow cavities help lighten the skeleton, but they also are assisted in breathing. So when we look at the hollow cavities inside of bones of modern day birds, once again, that is a throwback, though the function may be slightly different or modified. It's a throwback to the same characteristic we see in their relatives, the non-avian theropods, like dromaeosaurs and T-Rex and others. So the dinosaur sitting at your Thanksgiving table, it has a proper name, Meleagris gallopavo. That's the proper name of your turkey. And on this diagram, we have a technical schematic of a turkey skeleton. Technically, would we be able to call this a technical fowl? I thought that was a funny joke. Anyway, in red, you're seeing all of the characteristics that indicate that relationship to various groups of the dinosaurs that we've talked about. For example, the hinge-like ankle joint is a dinosaur morph characteristic. The backwards pointing pubis is something they get from other manoraptors. So all manoraptors have that characteristic. The furcula is a theropod characteristic. So all of these different things, the semilunate carpal wrist bone is present in all manoraptors. The loss of digit 5 is a theropod characteristic. The loss of digit 4 is an avitheropod characteristic. So we have general items, and then we have all of these items that are not visible in your roaster turkey, like feathers or something we know that was present in other Coelurosaurs. The pinnate feathers are what we see in advanced manoraptors. The toothlessness is a bird characteristic, but it has an antorbital fenestra. Your turkey has an antorbital fenestra, which all archosauriforms have. So all of these characteristics, you can bore your family and friends at Thanksgiving with all of these little characteristics that you're pointing out as you're dissecting that Thanksgiving turkey that let you know you are eating a dinosaur. Which brings me to this, the age-old question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? We've been discussing phylogenetics and the advance of characteristics over time and over lineages all semester. So if we look, well, the egg exists way back with amniotes, right? And chickens evolved much, much later. So I guess the egg came first. Easy enough. So like I said, I wanted to do a short lecture on the evolution of birds to kind of wrap up this unit. I know we haven't had many lectures since our last exam, but we're going to try to fit one exam in here. So we've covered the Cretaceous period and we've covered the evolution of birds. And what I want to do now is just go through a kind of pop quiz for yourself. I'm going to read off some questions of things that you might want to consider for the upcoming exam. And if you find that you can't answer any of these, you might want to start going back and reviewing some notes. So here are just some of the things I want you to start to think about, and we'll go through the answers then. First, what subgroup of macronarian sauropods diversified in the Cretaceous period? Remember, most of the sauropods we discussed were in the Jurassic, but we do have some in the Cretaceous, and what group were they? What two groups of ornithischian dinosaurs make up the clade Marginocephalia? Remember, that was a uniquely, as far as we know, Cretaceous group. What's the large inland sea that is present in North America during the Cretaceous period? What is the name of the first Cretaceous mountain building event that was highly volcanic? And finally, what is the name of the second Cretaceous to Eocene mountain building event that is currently called the Rocky Mountains? So what is the proper name of the Rocky Mountains, in other words? So again, just going to read off the answers to these now and kind of quiz yourself. And if you feel like, I didn't get any of these right, no worries. Now's a good time to start looking over some notes before the exam. The first group of macronarian sauropods that diversify in the Cretaceous are the titanosaurs. Remember, these are the giant sauropods, even bigger than the ones we have in the Jurassic. The two groups of ornithischian dinosaurs that make up Marginocephalia are the horned ceratopsians and the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs. Remember, they both have that modification to the back of their skull, where we get the name Marginocephalia, which actually means fringed skull or fringed head, because of the shield or shelf they have at the back of their skull. The large inland sea present in North America during the Cretaceous was the Western Interior Seaway, or the WIS. This is today why we have rolling flattish but rolling hills in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. The name of that first Cretaceous mountain building event that was volcanic is the Sevier orogeny. Not severe, but Sevier. And the second mountain building event that starts in the Cretaceous and goes into the Eocene of the Cenozoic, what we now call our Rocky Mountains, is the Laramide orogeny. So again, if none of these questions triggered any kind of response from you, I recommend you start looking over notes as quickly as possible and focus not necessarily just on these areas, but definitely on these areas as well as others. So, exam 3 for the lecture and lab quiz 3, both will be launched on Friday, November 11th at 5 p.m. As we've been doing throughout the semester, we will be having review sessions in preparation for this exam. On Wednesday, November 18th from 1:50 to 2:50, I will be hosting an online review session on Collaborate Ultra for the course. And we will be having an in-person review session on Friday, November 20th from 1:50 to 2:50 at Sage 4232. I recommend you join us for one, if not both, of these review sessions, as the in-person, of course, as per your comfort and availability. And the exam and the quiz will both be available from 5 p.m. on November 20th until 11:59 p.m. on November 23rd. So we're having the same amount of time over the weekend that we've been doing before. Obviously, you may use notes, you may use your book, you may review videos, but remember, you have 1 hour to complete both. You have 1 hour to complete the exam, you have 1 hour to complete the quiz once you start them. So it is in your best interest to study and have your materials laid out and organized, so as you're going through the exam, you're not shuffling through notes or zipping through videos or files trying to find an answer. It's best if you know the answer without having to look it up. So we have some potential topics for the essay portion. There'll be an essay and a small fill in the blank or a short answer portion. Remember, I'm going to pick one of these for the essay question, which will be more lengthy, right? And the other questions will be covered in other ways on the exam. So don't try to gamble. Instead, try to just look, have an understanding of all of these and have some kind of an essay prepared for all of these so you know what you're going to write when you see that exam question. So first, be able to discuss the evolution of birds. Included that discussion the various changes in characteristics between non-avian theropod dinosaurs to true modern birds throughout the Mesozoic era, and use some of the examples that we've talked about in this lecture. 2, discuss the conditions of deep ocean anoxia in the Cretaceous period. So we talked about how we had some very unique conditions in our oceans during the Cretaceous. What role do tectonics play in the development of that condition and the warm climates in the Cretaceous period? So what's the relationship between ocean anoxia, climate, and tectonics in the Cretaceous? Explain the differences between the Sevier and Laramide orogenies throughout the Cretaceous. How did these mountain building events differ, and how did they alter the Cretaceous landscape of North America? Remember, the Laramide is technically a continuation of the Sevier, but it changes the way in which that mountain building event is happening. Think about the change in angle of subduction as you're developing an answer for that question. And number 4, discuss the regional stratigraphy of the Cretaceous period in North America. What are some of the common facies that are seen in different formations? Is the entire Cretaceous period represented? Again, we're going to focus on North America for this one. So with all of these, I recommend you plan out and practice out writing an essay question. That way, when you take the exam, you have it ready to go. I've also included on Canvas an outline for the notes. Hopefully, you've been taking your own notes on the lecture content, and you're also going to be using these outlines as well. What I would recommend you do is practice writing out and prepare an essay for each one of these and use the information that is outlined in the study guide and in the notes as thorough as possible. When you're done doing that, go through the notes again and see what have you not used in one of these essays and make sure that you fully understand that information as well. So, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to help you out with those. Otherwise, I will see you in lab and hopefully in the review session.